friends, today I am delighted to be joined by Daniel Nayeri. He was born in Iran and spent some years as a refugee before immigrating to Oklahoma at age 7 with his family. He has had a long career in publishing, first as a literary agent, then an editor and publisher. And during that time, he's edited books in every category, from memoir to cookbooks, board books, picture books, so many more, a whole list. He's the author of several books, including Everything Sad is Untrue, a true story, and The Assassinations of Samir, the Seller of Dreams. He lives in the US with his wife and son, and I am just absolutely delighted to be chatting with you. Before I let you kind of introduce yourself a little bit and tell a bit of your story, I just have to tell you a story about my
Sure.
experience with your books. I love recommending books to people. That's always fun. But there are a handful of books that I feel like I hold in my hand and bestow them as precious gifts to others. And there's just a few books that I have like that level of memory of giving. One was The Wednesday Wars by Gary Schmidt. I just remember
Yes.
reading it and then coming down the stairs and handing it to my oldest children. This is beautiful. You must stop everything and read it immediately. One of my daughters had that same experience with A Long Walk to Water. She finished it and
Nice.
brought it to me and was like, Mom, you must read this book. And that for me is how I feel about um, your book, Everything Sad is
Oh,
Untrue. I feel like
thank you.
whenever I recommend it to people, I'm handing them something precious. So I'm really excited to chat with you.
Thank you. Well, you just named two of my absolute favorite people in children's literature. Both Linda Sue and Gary are people that I look up to and have in fact, weirdly enough, the very first book I published solo, my first book, the back of the book is a quote from those two people.
Wow.
So they're just about my faves.
Yeah, I mean, now I've talked to you. If I ever talk to Gary Schmidt, I might as well just retire from podcasting because I will have reached the pinnacle. But here at the beginning, why
Yeah.
don't I'll stop talking. You tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your story.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, nowadays, I sort of, when I describe to people if they want a quick introduction of who I am, I mean, books have been my life at this point, and I'm really pleased about that. So everything from, having grown up, I was born in Iran, and the first stories I remember are very much from a storytelling tradition of sitting around where there wouldn't be a TV in that space. And so dinner parties, if you can call them that, sort of dinner time, supper time in the evening, adults and kids would all kind of be in a mixed space, and storytelling would be the entertainment. That's sort of among the vaguest memories I have, or earliest memories I have of Iran. And so I kind of credit that a little bit to my love of stories, but I also credit an incredible era of deep boredom, right? So in the sense that we didn't really have books or packaged stories in the sense of TV or anything like that when we were sort of traveling to the United States, and so there was quite a lot of just imaginative play. I think a lot about imaginative play for young people. And then by the time we got to the United States, one of the greatest, I should say, aspects of living in the US is the proliferation and uh, um, robust quality of their library system. My gosh, like go to any small town in America and you can still walk into their library and there's just thousands of books and thousands of things there. I find it amazing. I've been a nomad here in the US. Like we lived in a trailer for a while. So I've been to a lot of towns. And the first thing we would do when we would go into a town would be like look up the library. And I'm always amazed at that. So when we came to the US, I kind of lived in that little library. It was my first real job with like a, paycheck, so to speak, was I was a library page as a 12-year-old. And then kind of immediately knew I wanted to be a writer. Went to school for creative writing and English literature. Was an agent, as you said in your bio. I've been for 25 years. My career was as an editor in New York and edited all sorts of things and wrote. I've written across a lot of genres as well. So, in the meantime, I've built bookshelves for people as a construction worker. I done book repair for like rare books. I just adore everything about them. I like everything from what they house in terms of stories to their actual physical experience of having them. I think they're so yeah, I suppose there's a lot of other things to say about me. Of course, I would not books are not the very first thing I would say, but in this context, they might be relevant. Nowadays, I'm a husband and a father. I used to be a chef, so a lot of my writing has a lot to do with food. But yeah, always a broad question, but I think those would probably give us enough hooks to kind of get a sense of what I like to do all day.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I could totally resonate with what you're saying about the library. That was always one of my favorite places
sure.
growing up. I was a library page as well as a kid.
You were.
And, you know, it's like the thing that I was so excited about when I found out I was pregnant with my first son. I was like, I get to take him to library story time, you know? So,
We were both pages. Does this mean we have to have like a shelf off? Did you do this as one of our big things among the pages was we would take one of those carts, the rolling carts, and each page would get a full one. And then, you would go and whoever could shelf their full cart first was like, the
the
winner.
winner.
Did you ever race your
I
shelf or
I
was that
didn't. You had a more fun library than I did.
it might have just been a way to incentivize us to do more work faster. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
maybe so. Harness that competitive spirit.
I got Tom Sawyered.
Now you know. You just figured it out.
That's right.
Well, you mentioned, you know, your early experience with the storytelling around the dinner table or the imaginative play where you're telling yourself stories even without a book. But I'm wondering if there were any particular stories as you began working in the library and had access to all these books that particularly captured your imagination. And then how has sort of your approach to your own personal reading developed over time?
Well, yeah. In terms of the stories that kind of captured me early, I've always been a fan of and returned to folk tales and fairy tales quite a lot. It's actually something that my wife and I really connected on. We met when we were 18 in school, and she was majoring in fairy tales. And I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world, And so I would often ask her about it. And if you take the thread of what fairy tales have meant to us, like where are they functioning now? There was a lot of crossover with what I was studying. I was studying comics. And so, the superheroes of and stories of the 60s and 70s seemed actually to cross over in theory a lot with fairy tales a lot. So the short answer to your question, when I was young, I was often finding myself in the fantasy stories. Tolkien, of course, becomes a foundational one, but so was Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett is a fantasy writer who kind of most notably for being so funny. He's a comedic fantasy writer. And I remember when I first read that, I thought, you can be funny? What are you talking about? I up till then read, Tolkien style high fantasy and never occurred to me. And of course, Tolkien nowadays I read and he's quite funny. But he's not like uproarious or, slapstick. He's not as much that. And whereas Pratchett really is. And that I think was a major influence and on not only my reading but my writing was that I realized the value of comedy in this sort of even in the most serious spaces. And so I would say those were kind of the biggest, and to this day, like if you ask me like what I just finished reading right now over there is a translation of the Arabian Nights, specifically the heroic stories. So Sinbad, Aladdin, Alibaba, those kind of later additions to the Arabian Nights. I'm reading Calvino's collection of Italian folk tales, which I think is great. It's one of those like big, thick books, kind of scares people, but actually every story is like 4 pages long, and it's really like the Italian version of what the Grimm's brothers did, or the Grimm brothers. And so that I think is kind of still what I'm reading in terms of what gets me excited and what my writing is kind of trying to do. So I would say fairy
Yeah.
tales in short. Yeah.
Well, you know, folk tales, fairy tales, mythology, they all kind of they share something in common. I think not only do they tell you a lot about the culture. And we could
Yeah.
link in like the superhero tales, right? Which is
Yeah.
sort of like our American version of a myth or a folk tale. Um, but they also like show across cultures this shared humanity, because you see so many of those same themes that come up again and again with fairy tales, mythology, folk tales, which I personally find really fascinating. And I think it might have been the very first season of the podcast, I interviewed someone the entire episode was about the gospel and fairy tales and how we see these elements that are like baked into the law, the goodness of God written on man's hearts across time and culture, and how you can really see that in fairy tales. So I'll try to link that in the show notes for this one.
Yeah, that fascinating. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you want to know what a culture thinks about its morals, that's the fastest way to get it, right? It is those are the questions at the heart of fairy tales is what is heroism? What is good? What is bad? Um, they're pretty straightforward about it. And so comics, is a good example for the United States because it would be hard to characterize the United States at any given moment, but go to the golden age of comics, the silver age, the sort of current age, and you'll get a pretty good sense. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have a question about this idea of hospitality in storytelling, because kind of unintentionally, and now I'm bringing it in intentionally, but unintentionally over the past season, that came up as a theme, this love of neighbor, this
Oh,
idea of
cool.
being hospitable, with a wide range of guests talking about a lot of different topics. And so it was really interesting to me to see this sort of naturally occurring as a common theme. But I noticed as I was rereading Everything Sad is Untrue and the many assassinations of Samir recently, that you bring up this idea of the relationship between the storyteller and the story hearer, um, in this idea of friendship, that
Mhm.
being at the root. And so I was wondering how you see the act of storyteller and story hearer, like hospitality. How is it a way we're honoring one another, regardless of which side of that relationship we're on? And then, like, from there, big picture, how does stories in general help us learn to love our neighbors more? But long question. So take that
That
however
is,
you want to go.
I'll take the first part first if it's okay, and then if I forget the second part, you can remind me. The in the stories that comes up a lot. In fact, it's funny you say that as you were asking the question and noting that it comes up in Everything Sad and in Samir. I have a book coming out called The Teacher of Nomadland, and it comes up again in the theme. But in this case, I mean, there's sort of iterations on the theme, and in this case, being in the context of being not hearer and reader, but reader and writer, but rather teacher and student.
Great.
And so I think along these terms quite a lot. And I suppose if I address the version of it that is kind of explored in Everything Sad, it began when I was in a critical theory course in undergrad, and I forget who this writer was. I want to say it was Roland Barthes, but it was just this sort of one-off sentence that was read that stuck with me forever, and it was that the writer inhabits the reader. This idea that the writer's words are quite literally, placed into the mind of the reader. The reader, when you take on the role of looking at these little markings on a piece of paper, you're letting that voice sort of take over your tongue, so to speak, or your brain, whatever you want to call it. You're letting this writer take the control for a second and put a bunch of words in your head. Um, which when described that way is a very invasive, intimate description of what reading and writing is like, right? I mean, this idea of inhabiting, and so much of the metaphor there is, I mean, inhabiting something is like being, possessed by someone, but also in the way that maybe your mouth is being puppeted, right? By someone else. And so I suddenly, when I heard that, I was struck by, as a college student, I'm constantly told to read lots of authors, and some of the books I'm reading I don't agree with and I don't really like, and that feeling some of us get when we say that we were so disgusted by a book that we threw it across the room, like we ejected this person from our mind as fast as possible, right? So I think it's perfectly fair as a result to throw books across the room. I fall on that side of the cat. You should feel free to do that. you should feel free to kick someone out if they have misused their welcome. You should feel free to kick them out. And in the same way, because suddenly I started to take that metaphor, and you can see it's a very easy step from the writer inhabits the reader to the reader welcomes the writer in.
Yeah.
And there are obligations when you are welcomed into something like someone's home, certainly into someone's mind. And those obligations are first and foremost to want good for them, right?
Mhm.
And so I have often felt while reading a book, especially in undergrad, I remember feeling as if I am reading a work and this writer wants me out of some deep well of anger or bitterness, like would like me to agree with them about this particular topic or whatever it might be. They want me to, they're coercing me. I would feel the hand of the author pushing a little too much, and I remember as a result sort of rejecting it, or feeling as a reader, and this is why, you know, being a good reader, being a critical reader is so important, is that fundamentally you are engaging with the writing, right? You are saying like, I'm going to let this in and I'm not going to let this in, right? And so that obligation always stuck with me. That dynamic always stuck with me. And so, but fast forward to when I'm writing a book about a young man who is himself a refugee and is new to the country, and is these kind of metaphors of being welcome are particularly potent to him. You can see that it comes up very quickly. This dynamic of speaking to the reader and wishing to be a good guest, wishing to be the kind of writer that they would not only want to welcome, but, you know, would befriend. And so that becomes probably the central theme, I would say, of that, of Everything Sad is Untrue. And really, I mean, he's too young as a narrator to know that quote of the writer inhabits the reader, but he's very clearly intuiting it and reacting to it. And so I think that's where a lot of the hostly themes in my writing comes from, is trying to manage. And also, especially when you're with kids, I mean, like, you know, I write and often children read my work, or you know, and so I think doubly you have to be careful as a guest, and to sort of um, well, to honor the influence that you have. Honor is the wrong word, right? To fear,
Yeah.
to fear the influence that you have, um, properly enough to use it gently and for good purpose.
With great power comes great
There
responsibility
you
to
go.
quote,
Yeah,
you
why
know?
didn't I just say it the easy way? And so yeah, exactly. So that's where I think those themes become like triply true for someone like me, right? Like it's I think of it very often as, you know, have you ever been invited into a kid's tree house, or into like those toy houses that are kind of just big enough to be in the living room but not bigger? And I don't know if you can tell from video, I'm not a small person. And so to be invited for like a tea party inside like a plastic house is a kind of environment where I'm aware that I could like break every chair, and if I stand up too fast, I'll wreck the house, and everything is small um and breakable. And I think of that all the time when I'm in somebody's mind, you know, and so you know, you just try to be careful.
Yeah, being both a good guest and then a good host as the reader. It
Yeah.
makes me think, I just finished reading Experiment in Criticism by C.S. Lewis and was discussing it with some friends recently. And, you know, that's one of his whole points in that book, is having this willingness to listen, right? If a guest comes in, you don't start like criticizing everything about them, right? That wouldn't be very kind or welcoming. From the reader's perspective, you know, having that willingness to have an open ear, right? Not that you have to accept and agree with everything that, you know, your guest says, but at least to listen because you care about them and you want to actually know what they think, right?
Right.
So I think C.S. Lewis would probably agree with everything you were just saying.
Yes.
So you're in good company.
I love that. Could we maybe just pull that sentence out and use it in every context? He
Yes.
C.S. Lewis would agree with everything Daniel was saying. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, how do you think, kind of in a broader context, does being the reader of the story help us learn to love our neighbors more?
Um, Goodness, you know, maybe I'm gonna go back to Lewis. Uh-oh. There was a quote, and I always get his quotes wrong. but there was a quote that was something like, if we saw people as they were meant to be seen, we would be tempted to worship them, right? This idea that, um, and it goes back to the idea that we were all created, in the image of God, the creator. And so there's some deep, beautiful, sacred thing that we can see inside each other, right? And I most see this, and I know it relates to reading. I think we've all heard the kind of the notions of reading one story and walking in someone's shoes, empathy, these kind of good ideas, and they're all true. So good. Um, I find it most apt when I talk to people. I'm like, have you ever noticed that when you watch like a reality show, even if you're watching a show that's like full of people who are just total messes, um, by the time you've watched like, I don't know, 12 episodes, you have this odd fondness and love for them for no other reason than the fact that the camera has been pointed at them for something close to 30 hours. And you go, I really believe that that's the case. I believe it's very true that if we were to just watch others on camera for 30 hours, long enough to get past the parts we dislike and past the all the ways they are annoying to us, and to even watch them through several instances of hurting people but also being hurt and whatnot, just seeing them in life. If we were to observe them this for 30 hours or so, we fall into some kind of love with them, and I find that fascinating because reality shows kind of like make their hay on finding really challenged people and putting them in even worse situations and having everybody misbehave. Um, but at the same time, uh, just watching them is kind of fascinating. Just seeing people as and because I think you get a glimpse of how they were intended.
Mm.
Um, and so I think with a story, it's all the easier. You don't have to watch a bunch of trash to do it. What an easier and better way to do it would be to just read a work and to start to understand. So that's one. It's this metaphor, this idea that when we watch people as they were intended, we see some glory of God in them. That's one. The other is actually because we understand the world in shorthand, right? We understand our world in the shorthand of characters. And I've said this before, that we'll say things like, well, be careful about him, he's kind of a Don Juan, like, be careful about her, she's all about Eve. Or he's such a quixotic guy, or she's, and we have our shorthand of understanding that Pangloss is a character who is optimistic to a fault, or that this person's a little sneaky, right? And Moliere does such a good job of giving us these short. Shakespeare does the best job of giving us shorthand characters that allow us to quickly understand the world and even discuss and understand each other. I can't imagine having to explain people without the benefit of stories. If we went, for example, to undergrad, as happens, and you have to explain everyone back home to all the people you just met in your dorm. If you didn't have the use of stories and characters to shorthand some of this, it would just take forever. It would take, I would need you to sit down and watch 30 hours of reality television about every single one of my friends in in order just for me to tell you a few things about them. So I think stories are also both in terms of the spiritual side, but also in terms of this practical, logistical side. They just simply help us understand each other. Uh, and so, yeah, I think it just on its face is the only way we could do it.
It's like as we read the story, we recognize the characters because we recognize something true about them that we've seen in people around us. But
Right.
then the more characters we read, the better able we are to understand the real people around us too. So it kind of works in unison, like both directions, I guess.
Right, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a cycle, right? So, every one of Austin's characters is very helpful when you're talking about dating, or every one of, Anna Green Gables, I think is just one of the great, and Shirley rather, is one of the great like character studies. And we can see pieces of, you could insult somebody just by saying which character they are, right? Like,
Yes.
just you can or you can also give them a certain sense of complex insult, right? Not just like Like, do you know Ignatius Riley as a character in the Confederacy Dunces? He's the main character in Confederacy Dunces, and he's sort of famous for being a character who refuses to go on the heroic journey, right? He will not learn anything. He's the most stubborn character I have ever encountered. And, but he's also a visionary and a someone who is fighting against the tide of the 20th century. He refuses, he quite literally refuses the 21st century. And there's something about that I think is heroic and funny. And but to call somebody Ignatius Riley would be a fascinating and very complex kind of assignment. Same thing with Don Quixote, right? Is you are at your heart, you are heroic, but you're awfully misguided as well.
Yeah.
I think it's helpful.
My dad grew up in rural North Carolina, and I grew up, you can't really hear it in my voice now, but when I'm with that side of the family, I
Yeah.
definitely, my dialect changes.
Say
But I,
banana pudding.
banana pudding.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I hear it. I hear
Yeah, so, but I did not know until I went to college that I had been dropping the H on the word humble my whole life. I had
Uh-huh.
been saying humble. Had
Oh,
no
yeah.
idea that that was wrong. Like, that was just how everybody said it. And so when I found out, my first thought was, oh no, I'm like Uriah Heep, you know? So I was like, that was not a character I ever wanted to be like. Anyway.
That's right. It's funny. Yeah, there also are guardrails, right? There are certain characters that I want to be so little like that I actually, shift myself
Exactly.
over. That's so funny.
Oh man.
Like,
All right. Well, another thing that I noticed in your books, and I don't know, so I feel a little awkward. Like I'm like, I've noticed a theme. I don't know. Like, well, that wasn't there. I don't know what you're talking about. So feel free to be like, you are seeing
you
things that do
misread
not
it.
exist. But something that seems to come up to me in both books again was this difference between the stories we remember, then the stories we tell, and then like the events as they actually occurred. And
Mhm.
sometimes there's overlap, and sometimes they're very different. So I was curious what your thoughts were about, the truth of story that is maybe separate from its historical accuracy, and then the difference between the power of a story told in love versus one that's used to manipulate or deceive.
Wow, that's a great question. Well, yeah, I won't spend too much time on the fact that it's true that we don't have very good memories, right? I think we can all agree on that one, that we're not all accessing the truth all the time, despite the fact that we might, with good intention, be thinking that we are. Some of that is natural when you have a young narrator um, because young narrators don't actually often perceive all the complexity of a situation, and so they catch on to the wrong side of things and maybe are misperceived. So there's a knowledge gap there that kind of creates a layer. So I think of these in terms of layers of accuracy, right? Like the veils between us and the truth, right? And I don't know if I am saying anything controversial here, right? Like every single person who's ever, like I believe, there is an objective truth. And I believe it was even given to us. And yet also we quite often fumble the bag with how with our sort of limited ability to understand it, with, let's face it, some of our desires to misunderstand it in just the right, most convenient ways. So there's a lot of layers that get put, even if you were to say, hey, this I can point to it, this is the word of truth, this is true, maximally true, inherently true. You can say all those things, and I agree with you, frankly, but um that doesn't change the fact that layers of misperception occur almost immediately. And that's the nature of our world and our consciousness. Our, frankly, we live in a, we see but in a mirror darkly, right?
Right.
So like we fundamentally do not have access to perfect truth telling. And on top of that, like our egos and our pain and our heartbreak when some fight has occurred and we wish to preserve our dignity, or we wish to walk some of that back the way we behaved, or we wish to win, whatever it is. Suddenly there's a lot of incentives to misunderstand. And so I think that part's pretty pretty easy. I think the question you had on the second part of that was a little more well, it would be more challenging to sort of break down would be what is the distinction between a story told in love and a story told, what was the second
To
descriptor you have?
manipulate or
To
deceive.
manipulate.
Yeah.
Well, so that's great, right? The second part helps us in a little bit easier than the first part because the first part has a lot of common um, landmines that people like walk into, right? Because if a story is told fundamentally to manipulate or deceive, what we're effectively saying is it's farther and far, it's layering your vision, it's farther and farther from the truth. I think it's pretty we're pretty all pretty commonly. I think the problem here is when we start to accuse each other of doing that, and try to, and this happens in families all the time, of trying to adjudicate and excavate, a memory that we all just fundamentally disagree on. Um, I think that ends up being a large part of the dynamic of families that had really maybe all families. I try not to speak for all families because I have no clue what any of them are like, but um so I don't know which part of my family made it so. Maybe being a family that went through a bunch of like traumatic stuff, being a family that had a lot of difficult personalities in it. I don't know, like whatever category we fit in that made it so, it was so. And so I spent a lot of my adult life just trying to adjudicate what was true. And to be very honest, why I wrote Everything Sad the way I did was because as an adult, I wanted to hew as closely to the truth as I could. Um, and in trying to excavate those stories, realized that it was an impossibility just with some of the characters involved, with some of the information that wasn't available because I can't go back to Iran, but also I don't know if we're ever going to get down to it. Like, can you ask any couple that have divorced and had unfortunately a rancorous relationship? Try to go and get to the bottom of why it happened. And boy, it's just not going to happen. Like you're not going to get consensus. And so um, I think a lot of the stories we tell each other are defensive positions. And so I think a lot of what I was doing when I was writing this book was reacting to that notion. I'll quickly explain so that I'm not rambling. One of my jobs as a early editor, as a young editor, was editing a lot of celebrity memoirs.
Okay.
And one of the things that happens when you edit memoirs is you realize this exact thing that you're describing, right? Of telling stories as a weapon, in this case, a defensive posture of saying, well, I'm a celebrity. You think you know this stuff about me, but let me set the record straight. Let me tell you what it was really like. And that's what's promised on the cover of the book. But of course, what's actually happening in the edit is I would notice a lot of times celebrities would react to when their ghostwriters or their co-writers had written a scene sort of more objectively. They wanted to make sure that it was massaged so that they didn't look too stupid, so that they didn't look malicious. And you'll note this, like if you read memoirs a lot as a genre, you'll notice that like conveniently the narrator is never the villain.
Right.
It's like it's always written by the good guys, and it's always they were always the smartest one at brunch. I always joke, right? They always have the comebacks that we all think of later, they all thought of right then. And so I remember becoming fairly cynical about that genre and thinking like, well, are all these just people making themselves look good? Is this all just lies? And how malicious is it? And the answer is, of course, if you were the other person at the brunch, it's pretty malicious, right? And so when I started to write Everything Sad, one of the things I really wanted to address in the form of the story was how flawed this person is, this narrator is, and how he's doing his best, and he's even doing his best in good faith. He tries to present that, but that he's sort of woefully inadequate as a person to, kind of be given the mantle of truth teller.
Mm.
And so, and he's buckling under that. The very first sentence of the book is, all Persians are liars and lying is a sin. He's put that into Persians, but the category is people. And so that's where the book begins, because that's where the nature of memoir begins.
Yeah. And then in Samir, you have more of like the trickster tales, right?
Right.
So like stories, you kind of are like, wait, am I supposed to believe this story? I don't want to, spoil anything for anyone who hasn't read the book.
Yeah.
Um, but would you see it like as a difference there too? Well, it's part of that manipulation, I guess, or the way you want someone else to perceive the story, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to seeking to actually communicate as close as you can to the truth, although we will all be flawed in that. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
I
the
just thinking
attempt
about
is
it
a
some more.
fairly, yeah, I mean, the attempt is where we put most of the emphasis, right? We all assume everybody's flawed, but then I'm doing my best here versus I think you're right. Samir is he's that's not a story that purports to be true in any way. Uh, so the narrator is telling you his kind of adventure across the Silk Road, and you're right. There's a lot of questions as to exactly how um reliable,
Yeah,
is he going to be. I think everything said, the narrator is much more incompetent than unreliable,
yeah.
whereas
Or
in this
maybe
case.
like an immature, like there's the youthfulness of the narrator that comes
Mhm.
across more than, I wouldn't say he's incompetent. You just see he's young, like he's limited,
Yeah. Well,
right?
he wouldn't get the job of narrator if it was a job. He's not qualified, is what I'm
Yeah,
trying to say,
yeah,
for that position. And he knows it, and he's very afraid as a result. And
yeah.
so whereas, yeah, it's I think of, if I have one way of telling stories that I really just love, is stories within stories. Like, I love knowing who the narrator is. Often in stories, your goal is to just be an invisible narrator.
Mhm.
You don't want to have all that frame of, okay, so who's telling me this? Oh, it's this professor who's writing it 10 years later. Or, oh, it's, this guy is telling the story to someone else and we're seeing them fidget. But for me, I really enjoy that. I mean, this is what the Arabian Nights is. Like, we were very aware that these stories are being told by this woman, Scheherazade, to the king. um, I think I do that almost every time. If I'm given, like, that to me is not a type of story. That is how stories work, is I want to know who's telling it. Because the minute I know who's telling it, the layers of my interpretation sort of expand exponentially, because now I'm thinking, okay, so, well, you're saying this person was, a villain, but what does that say about you? And what do I know about your presuppositions in this situation? And so on and so forth. So you're starting to question the teller, and I've always found that fascinating. I do
Yeah.
that in picture books all the way up to, novels.
Well, would you say that that is a distinction or a difference, that story within stories of like a Western mode of storytelling versus Eastern, or what are there other things that you would see as kind of a distinction there?
Yeah, I mean, so broadly speaking, right? Not nobody, the East doesn't own anything and the West doesn't really own anything. But yeah, broadly speaking, the terms, like in literary discussions, some people call that story within story within story structure. They call it the Chinese box narrative. So, like, boxes in boxes. And then some people call it the Arabian Nights narrative, which is kind of probably the prototypical version of that. So yeah, it's much more common in those kinds of stories. Um, but great exemplars we have now in the West as well. And in the West, I think I think, the film tradition, if you start from the moment film occurs, the film tradition has, I think, influenced the American novel to want to be an invisible lens a little bit more. And this, we're speaking broadly in terms of like patterns. We're not speaking in terms of what everybody does. But I think if I had to guess, I would say that the visual nature of a film, this idea of like, I'm looking at a frame. It's why I think, American novels are very filmic, and that's great. But I think that has a lot to do with it. Is we want to see what's there. We want to see what's happening. Um, Whereas I want to know who's talking.
Yeah. Okay, that's really fascinating because I was just discussing Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman with my 15-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
It's one of those books that was hugely impactful to me as a teen, so I make all my teens read it. Some of them have liked it more than others. But one of the things he talks about in that book, right, is like the medium itself is the message. And
Mhm.
so the kinds of ideas, the medium that is being used restricts the kinds of ideas that can be communicated, which then influence the way a culture or a society thinks and feels about life. And so that just what you were saying about like the rise of film, right, as this medium and the way then that has trained our brains to think the kinds of ideas, the way we see a story, because of that
Yeah.
then has even impacted books. I mean, I'm sure everyone has had that experience where you read a book and you're like, man, it's the author. Like, I feel like they're like setting this up to be turned into a movie, you know? Like,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
That nowadays, of course, the market has that influence as well of authors just wishing it was a movie.
Mhm.
But I think it's really there's something that really rewires in us when we think about, for what it's worth, I think the age of the phone camera and the what where we're at now is going to actually reverse some of this, where we're going to ask who's holding the camera and why are they pointing it here, where's the rest of the frame, what's going on. I don't often look at a movie by like a Spielberg or a Kubrick and go, well, what's outside this frame? Like I'm usually under the impression that the box that I'm looking through is the truth and is all that's happening in this world, and then I'm going to cut to the most important thing next. But imagine if it was a movie that was like, I don't know, like Jurassic Park, right? And instead of like, gong, oh, look, the water just rippled, gong, the water rippled again. Jeff, Bloom, Goldblum just said, uh-oh. And now instead of cutting to the face of a dinosaur, we were to just like, I don't know, cut to anywhere else in the world with some, dude and his wife sitting by the fire reading a newspaper in like Sheboygan. And you'd be like, what?
What's going
What
on?
is happening? Like our understanding of the everything that's important and all action and truth and is the fact that the camera is pointed at it. And I don't think we question it all that much, except, there's some great experimental films. But um, now that we don't have the Spielbergs of the world and the great directors of the world, you know, curating the frame, I do think we're going to ask that question a lot more, and I'm kind of excited by that. I
Yeah.
think we're, but we'll see. I mean, that's one way in which stories might start to change.
Yeah.
There's so many others.
Yes, yes, definitely. Well, I wanted to ask about this quote. You say, what you believe about the future will change how you live in the present. And so there's a lot of hard things, a lot of hard events in your stories. There's this idea of, is it an accident or is it providence?
Mhm.
Especially in the context of those difficult times of suffering or difficult events. My family has been in the midst of suffering for the past few years, for sure, in a particular way. But I think
Mhm.
just any human has that experience, even if you haven't like been in a traumatic
Right.
situation. Like sometimes just the ordinary hard of daily life
Mhm.
is its own form of suffering this side of heaven. So how does hope
Yeah.
that future hope, impact this current time, especially in times of suffering? And then what role does stories have in building or encouraging that hope?
Well, so that section, I mean, for about 23 years, my pastor was Tim Keller in New York City, and I sort of credit. I mean, that's my entire adult life, right? Like, so in a lot of ways, I give him all that, a lot of credit and thanks and gratitude for just quite a lot of my understanding of the gospel, and also just the theology of everyday life. And in this case, that comes very much from a example he'd give us all the time. It's actually in the book as well. A version of it is in, this idea that an example he'd give of two people with the same job, right? And the job is boring and horrible, and it's going to be a year long, but at the end of the job, one of them is going to get, $50,000, and another one's going to get $50 billion, right? And you know, we all agree, I think we all agree that the person who's in their head spending $50 billion is going to have a really easy time of it. And what does that mean? Like, what are we saying? Famously, Einstein, when asked by, he was feeling cheeky, I guess, that day when he was being asked, like, what is the theory of relativity? And he explained it with the theory of relativity is that spending 1 minute with a beautiful girl or 1 minute with your hand on a hot plate are vastly different minutes. And I was like, that's such a great quote from this like I just remember the only version of Einstein I ever think of is from a romantic comedy with Meg Ryan and Tim Robbins.
IQ.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's like it's Walter Matthau pretending to be Einstein, but I always think of him saying it. Maybe it was from that movie. I don't even know. But the point is, we all implicitly understand these things, right? We implicitly understand that our um mindset. Now, it's horrible. I think it's horribly crass to walk up to somebody who's in the midst of suffering, especially like deep suffering of loss and pain, and to say, "Hey, buddy, like you just got to change your mindset." And all you got, if you just change your mindset, this funeral wouldn't be so bad. That's not I hope the way that anyone would deploy this, but it also just happens to be true. I also wouldn't deploy like lots of real facts about the world to people at the wrong time because that wouldn't be the right time to tell them. So while I believe this fact that the what we understand to be the not only the nature of life but the nature of our afterlife will absolutely affect how we conduct ourselves, but also how we experience it. Um, I often hear people being like, "Well, huh, would you say that to some?" And again, even the examples are horrible, right? Like, would you say that to a parent who's just blah blah? And I'm like, no, of course not. Of course I wouldn't. But I also wouldn't tell them, "Hey, guess what? Like, that hospital bill's also going to be horrible." Like, I just don't walk up to people and say these things. But the realities of life are as they are, and I think it's a very apt and important aspect of understanding the value of hope, which is not that it is some sort of empty optimism, but rather that it is the belief, and this is a very practical and tactile belief, that there will come a cosmic and true justice, and that will happen. And that the deep injustices of everything from childhood suffering to war and famine will be set right. And that's the epigraph of the book, is that sort of famous Dostoevsky um, epigraph. And that was the epigraph that I remember most notably after September 11th, that Tim sort of put in this church bulletin, and I remember just thinking, I tore it out, of course, and it was in my Bible forever, and that's how it ended up becoming the epigraph of Everything Sad, which is, I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, and it keeps going to, that at the world's finale, something so beautiful will come to pass, that it will suffice for all hearts, that, for all the blood we've shed, that it will make it possible not only to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. Boy, that is a high standard, right? That not only what a fascinating extra he puts at the end of this. This is this sort of person in Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and he's talking about what he believes, right? And he says, I believe like a child. Like a child is probably my second favorite phrase in that whole thing. My first favorite phrase is not only to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. The standard there is so high and frankly onerous to anybody still alive on Earth that I think it's a nigh offensive phrase to say. Like, if you were to walk up to anyone in a hospital waiting room and say that, I don't know if I'd be mad if they punched you in the face. I'm not sure I'd be mad, but it's, in my opinion, true.
Yeah.
And so you have to acknowledge, if that is what you believe, then you should probably tell people,
Yeah.
because it helps.
Yeah. And then I think when we read a story that captures that idea,
Hmm.
right? Even though perhaps it is a, a fiction made up,
Right.
But there is something that is still true in that story that reminds us of that hope. Like you were saying, it's not just this sort of rank optimism, but it's a hope that doesn't disappoint. And sometimes we need that story that's outside of our like reality to remind us of the true thing, right?
Yeah.
Because
Well,
it's easy to
optimism is so
forget.
silly to us too, right? Like, I mean, it's going back to Pangloss from in like Voltaire's Candide, right? You have this guy who the whole story is just is quite literally a what's the word? A satire of this. I mean, a satire of probably people like me. He probably perceives this where you have Dr. Pangloss who's just kind of a dopey optimist who goes from one horrible thing to the next, and they're horrible. Like they'll like come across a sudden like battle that has just happened, and it's just a field of people who've been dismembered and dying, and you're like, oh my gosh, how horrible. And Dr. Pangloss is like, do. And at one point, his sort of famous line is, we'll keep going, and if whatever comes isn't better, at least it will be new, right? And of course, it's never better. The new thing is never better. It's always worse. And I think that's a completely fair critique of this life. I think it's completely fair for someone like Voltaire to be like, why do you think it will be better than why? Like it might just be worse. And the answer is like, yes, that is fact. In this life, it might just get worse. That is why what we're describing is not. It's after. And so and as a result, it's a completely faith-based thing. And I have I don't even have a desire to try to make it like, I don't know, a watertight argument. I just don't. It is
It's a
there.
truth we receive, right? It is a
Yeah.
truth we receive, and then
So
we then believe it,
it's just
not
not
something we can
incumbent on me.
defend.
Yeah, I've never felt the what is that line from oh golly, I'm gonna forget her name. She's a great poet, and her line though, I never knew how little risk I ran of being asked to set my people free. And in this case, like I do not run the risk of being asked to create the watertight argument of what happens to us. That's not been my task. So
Yes.
yeah.
Well, moving from stories a little bit more specifically to the craft of writing, I know that you, I think, either have coming out or it is either new or about to come out, something about helping writers develop. But what advice
Yeah.
would you give someone who wants to grow as a writer?
Oh, well, so in that field, I know there's a lot of ways to tackle these things. I really believe in I suppose you'd call it the slightly more blue collar or the version that is deeply practical in the sense that I really believe that there's no such thing as a talent on this topic. It's entirely built on how much you'd like to work that muscle out. And that muscle being like not only imagination, but the craft of story. And so I actually, yeah, I just finished this book. This is the first book so I've published a lot of books as an editor and I've written a few, but this one is the first I have written and published myself. So I'm really excited about it. It's called How to Tell a Story. And it's kind of like my 101 course on the topic. It sort of it kind of posits this idea that I think everybody who's going to open this thing will have no problem on the imagination side of things. But my job is to sort of help out with the scaffolding of the underpinning elements of story. So the book has this kind of like inspiring kind of board here, but the trick of the board and it's got two big flaps, right? It's got these flaps, and on the flaps are these images, and the backgrounds of the images are color coded so that so the book can turn it itself into this little like symbol code system, right? So here it is. So it says all the images with the backgrounds that are orange are people and animals, and all the blues are things, and purple are places, and so on. So that now the book can say, tell me a story about a orange who wants nothing more than a blue. And now that could be a boy who wants a dog or a mermaid who wants a taco. Like none of this stuff matters. That part is completely yours. And the sort of emphasis is to put pen to paper as soon as possible. But the chapters are broken down into things like conflict, motivation, dialogue, characterization. And at the end of every chapter, there's like instruction on that topic, like what is motivation? And then at the end of that chapter, there are all these prompts using that system. So here, for example, and the prompts are all sort of like color coded. A lot of this is like we homeschool my son, and we have a club called the Storytelling Club where other kids, usually some of them homeschooled, are come in and will do a lot of like sometimes they'll do exercises out of this book. Sometimes they'll do like freeform storytelling. There, of course, the big project is they've got this big, story that they're working on that is epic, gigantic, epic
Of
fantasy that
course.
everybody, the big debates have occurred over what should happen. But as an exercise, you can pop this sort of like jump to these prompt pages, and it'll be like, "I found it," said the orange, lifting the blue into the air. "I finally found it." And go from there, right? Or the siblings agreed never to blank again, like some verb, or the ruler of this particular any place, the lab or the kingdom or the cemetery, died, and all was right and happy for a long time, right? And so there's just dozens and dozens of prompts in here for that kind of play. I don't know if you heard that, but that was construction happening outside. And so yeah, so the idea is very much to kind of take you through these um parts of storytelling, and then just sort of build as many exercises in there as possible.
So both combining the like playing with words and the practice of setting pen to paper, but also learning the skills and the techniques and those things as well. So
Yeah.
what age would you say that that book is best for?
Well, so initially I had published it for kids, and then this is the totally revised edition. I expanded it into two chapters that are kind of more complex, and then sort of added and changed a bunch of stuff. So now it is a general audience, kind of ages. I'd say 10 and up is probably the best. 12-year-olds are using it in my house is kind of maybe the um, best answer for that. But yeah, it's kind of general at this point. And working on so it's called How to Tell a Story, and on How to Tell a Story workshop, a lot of my personal workshops when I go speak is based on this book. And so I'm working on the workbooks that are built. A lot of what I published later in my career as an editor were workbooks type sort of like in the trade space. So things like if you've ever seen like the Brain Quest summer workbooks, we did those, or the Big Fat Notebooks, which are sort of for middle graders. We did those, and then later a Tinker Active series, and one great series is called Outdoor School, and it's kind of Big Fat Notebooks for nature, and they're really beautiful and visual. There's like a lot of paintings in them. So a lot of the stuff that I was working on as an editor was educational stuff that found its way into it's sort of my first blush with the homeschool community in general was a lot of my, I had come from we were doing just like nonfiction and literary fiction. So I'd gotten to work with Gary and, Linda Sue Park and stuff like that, and gotten to meet them. But then I went to this place and it was all kind of workbooks. And so that was the first time I really came across that community in general. And we were publishing, what we called educational supplemental material, right? It's not going to be the curriculum, but it sure is nice to have in the classroom. And so it kind of building off of that and doing more workbooks on storytelling is kind of what I'm working on next.
That is awesome. Well, I will definitely include links to that book and your resources
Yeah.
in the show notes, because I'm sure lots of people listening are like, wait, I need to jot this down before I forget. So I'll save it in the show notes. Don't worry.
Fair enough. Thank you.
This has been an absolute delight and pleasure to get to chat with you. Here at the end, I do want to ask you the questions that I ask all of my guests. We kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but what are you personally reading lately?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. So I'm returning to the Arabian Nights. That because I'm sort of working on something that touches that. Brian Jakes. Some people call him Brian Jacques, but I think it's Brian Jakes. I could be wrong, but the Red Wall series is always easy to read and lovely. My son has discovered manga, and so I follow along with him a lot. That's a category that I watch closely. And so there's one
Gotta
particular.
make sure you don't let the wrong guest in the house, right?
Yeah, that one's those age ranges on those things are all over the place. And so, but one that I could recommend that I loved is actually the closest thing I've read to Calvin and Hobbes, in the sense that it's about a young girl and her dad. And she's just it's all just slice of life. Like a whole episode would be about making pancakes. It's not so there's not like, it's not an action manga, but boy, it's just lovely. It's called Yotsuba, and it's one of those just family stories. And over the course of these books, you get to meet all their family friends, and I really kind of have adored just living with those characters. So that's kind of what I'm reading right now. Goodness, I
I
think
have to
that
ask, since
covers
you
it. Yeah.
mentioned Redwall, have you ever read The Mistmantle Chronicles by M.I. McAllister?
I haven't, no, but I'm writing
Okay,
this
well,
down.
this is one
Yeah.
of those books and series that I do not understand why more people are not talking about it. But for fans of Redwall, I would definitely recommend The Mistmantle Chronicles. The first book is Urchin of the Riding Stars. It's beautifully written. The story is great. Animals with swords is always fun. But
Yeah.
highly recommend that to you.
I'm always that's my I think of that as like the category of I don't know. It's this right now. I still I'm very just like delighted by. I say right now as if I haven't been all my life, but animal fantasy's always been kind of the dream category for me. I think it's just so wonderful. So I will absolutely be looking it up. Thank you.
Yes, well, you'll have to let me know what you think. All right, final question is, what would be your best tip for dealing with a homeschool day that seems to be going all wrong?
Wiggles. Yeah, I am a big believer in cut the day right there and go do something physical, whether that be jump into a pool or, usually I try not to make it like it's something, chore like mowing the lawn would probably solve this too, but it wouldn't get as much um but I'm a wouldn't be as effective on that front. I think PE class entering exactly at the right time. I'm a big believer in that. And we cook a lot. I cook a lot with my son, so I make him breakfast. He helps make lunch, and then he is my sous chef for dinner. And so often when we're feeling listless, that's happened yesterday. Yesterday it was like 4, and we'd kind of run out of stuff to do, and um we were starting to just kind of do, boredom stuff, where it was just nothing was. And I said, well, why don't we'll get up and we'll make something a little bit harder than usual. And what that usually means is not a meal, but rather like a dessert ends up happening, right? Because you've just added an hour to your prep time. So, um, he usually is very okay with that. And at the same time, it's incredible. As far I'm a believer in, I love those skills entering, and I think one of the reasons I think homeschool is so wonderful is, I work, I volunteer with Boy Scouts as well, and you'll meet some of these kids and they just have such a broad base of talents and skills. And so in this case, I end up doing one of those things where like, let's go do some wood burning or some cooking or some PE or whatever it is. I'm a big believer. And you can't obviously pull that ripcord every day. So as you know, but if it's really going off the rails, if we're really, I tend to think that's always my that's that big emergency button is let's go make something.
I
So,
love that. And
so
actually, you know what? That like, let's go make something. I can just see that's actually like also metaphorically, like you can,
yeah,
there's that can go a lot of places. That could be telling a story or doing
yeah.
something with your hands physically, doing something. I don't know. Let's go make something. I think that could be just like a
That's
call
the
to
mantra.
action for every day, right?
Well, the big thing I tell, yeah, because there's like unstructured time is kind of the beauty, the feature and the bug it can be of homeschooling, I think. And one of the things that a heuristic for assessing how you're managing unstructured time is I tell my son, I'm like, look, I love consuming stuff. Like I love comics and books and video games and movies. Like, who do you think I am? Like, that's how do you think I even became a writer? Like, I love reading books. Like, sitting and reading is great. Um, but I want every day to be proportionally sort of managed so that there is producing and consuming are happening in equal measure. So like if you've spent the day, if you've been just taking in like great, now let's go make something. That's a big one in our family in general. And it can be like that doesn't mean we're like good at making everything. You know what I mean? Like you should see some of my junk crafts. Like I'm not pitching that we're awesome, but it is the distinction in your mind of being an active participant in the world as opposed to sort of a passive, and I don't want to ever make them seem bad. I would like to redeem the idea of sitting there and watching a movie, right? But the only way that that can be true is, one, if it's a good movie; two, if it isn't the only thing you did all day. So yeah,
Right.
so that, I mean, as long as we have, an equal measure of that, and it can be his guitar practice, it can be making a meal. It doesn't have to be, but yeah, and as you said, it could be sitting and telling a story. It can be all those things. So it's delightful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, where can people find you and your books all around the internet?
I'm pretty easy to find. I'm actually a big believer in being easy to find. So like people can find, I mean, like my address is probably on the internet, but like uh all the socials are, I'm only on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, because that's the how old I was. That's a function of my age. If I understood the other ones, maybe I would. But my website is easy to place to find a list of my books. How to Tell a Story Workshop is a good place to look at my storytelling stuff. Um, but yeah, you can just come to my house, eat some cheese or something. I don't know. I feel like this is the internet's a terrible place to meet me, but it is a place where there's a lot of lists about and pictures, I guess. And so that would be good. But
Well,
yeah, cause shake my hand.
I will have links to those things in the show notes, not your, actual physical address.
You
Although if
know,
someone wants to go find it and hit you up for some cheese,
I should be careful about saying that. Like, you've got a lot of followers. Maybe this, like, suddenly this turns into more cheese than I can afford.
Yeah,
Like,
right. Maybe they can come bring you cheese. How about that? If you're
thank
gonna
you.
go find his house, bring him the cheese. Okay.
Yes, you may beguile me with cheese. That sounds good.
Oh, well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I would love for you to take a moment to share this episode with a friend. Definitely, if you have not read all of these books that we have mentioned today, definitely check those out. Make sure they're in your library system. This is your, periodic reminder. You can request your library buy new books if they don't have it. So make sure they have Daniel Nayeri's books. And until next time, happy homeschooling.